The worship of the serpent. Chapter 1. Serpent worship in Asia. The worship of the serpent is supposed by Bryant to have commenced in Chaldea, and to have been the first variation from the pure Sabaism one. That it was intimately connected with Sabaism cannot be doubted, for the most prevailing emblem of the solar god was the serpent too, and wherever the Sabaean idolatry was the religion, the serpent was the sacred symbol. But the universality of serpent worship, and the strong traces which it has left in astronomical mythology, seem to attest an origin coeval with Sabaism itself. The earliest authentic record of serpent worship is to be found in the astronomy of Chaldea in China, but the extensive diffusion of this remarkable superstition through the remaining regions of the globe, where Chinese wisdom never penetrated, and Chaldean philosophy was but feebly reflected, authorizes the inference that neither China nor Chaldea was the mother, but that both were the children of this idolatry. That accidental circumstances very materially affected the religions of the early heathen at different times, by introducing innovations both in gods and altars, worship and sacrifices, cannot be denied. But it is equally true that uniformly with the progress of the first deviation from the truth, has advanced the sacred serpent from paradise to Peru. To follow the traces of this sacred serpent is the intention of the following treatise, and it is confidently expected that few ancient nations of any celebrity will be found which have not, at some time or other, admitted the serpent into their religion, either as a symbol of divinity, or a charm, or an oracle, or a god one. Into the creed of some he has insinuated himself in all these characters, and is so mixed up with their traditions of the origin and end of evil, that we cannot, without violence to all rules of probability, reject the consequence that the prototype of this idolatry was the serpent in paradise. 1. Babylon. In tracing the progress of the sacred serpent, we commence with Asia, as the mother country of mankind, and in Asia, with Babylon, as the most ancient seat of an established priesthood. The information which we possess concerning the minute features of Babylonian idolatry is from various causes very narrowly circumscribed. Either the classical writers who visited Babylon were not admitted into the arcana of the Chaldean worship, or they were contented with giving a short and summary account of it, expending the chief strength of their descriptive powers upon the history, policy, and magnificence of the mother of cities. Herodotus, whose diffuseness on the history and customs of the Babylonians is considerable, enters but little into their religion, and Diodorus Siculus, minute in his measurements of the walls and gardens, comprises his description of the temple of Belus in a few sentences. Ophiolatria, as a recognized religion, was nearly extinct when Diodorus visited Babylon, for the city was almost deserted by its inhabitants, and the public edifices were crumbling to decay. But the silence of Herodotus is the more remarkable, since he mentions the serpent worship of both Egypt and Greece, which was prevalent in his time. The idolatry could scarcely be obsolete in Babylon at that period, since it existed in full vigor but 70 years before, in the days of Daniel, and though it received a signal overthrow from its exposure by that prophet, yet the tumultuous conduct of the Babylonians on that occasion, as it evinces their attachment to the idolatry, warrants the inference that they would cling to it long after its abolition, even by a royal decree. 1. But most probably Herodotus did not take the trouble to inquire into the superstitions of the common people, being content to describe what was the established religion, and even this he notices in a very cursory manner. From Diodorus, however, we learn what is sufficient to assure us that the serpent, as an object of worship, was not altogether forgotten in Babylon. Though disguised under the more specious appearance of symbolical sanctity, he informs us that in the temple of Bel, or Belus, was an image of the goddess Rhea, sitting on a golden throne. At her knees stood 2 lions, and near her very large serpents of silver, 30 talents each in weight. There was also an image of Juno, holding in her right hand the head of a serpent. 1. The name of the national god Bel is supposed to signify nothing more than Lord, and was also sometimes appropriated to deified heroes too. It is more probably an abbreviation of Obel III, the serpent god. The Greeks, remarks Bryant, called him Beliar, which is singularly interpreted by Hesychius to signify a dragon, or great serpent from which we may conclude that the serpent was, at least, an emblem or symbol of Bel. But if the apocryphal history of Bel and the dragon be founded upon any tradition, we must conclude that the dragon, or serpent, for the words are synonymous, was something more than a mere symbol. We must conclude that live serpents were kept at Babylon as objects of adoration, or, at least, of veneration, as oracular or talismanic. This custom was observed at Thebes in Egypt 1, and at Athens 2, and therefore there is nothing incredible in the fact at Babylon. However suspiciously then we may regard the apocryphal writings in general, we are constrained to admit that the author of Bel and the Dragon, though he may have embellished the narrative, has given us a true picture of Babylonian superstition. In that same place there was a great dragon, which they of Babylon worshipped. And the king said unto Daniel, Wilt thou say that this is of brass? Lo, he eateth and drinketh, thou canst not say he is no living God, therefore worship him. From the Chaldeans, we are told that the Hebrews obtained the word Abaddon, as a title of the Prince of Darkness. This word may signify the Serpent Lord. Heinsius 1, cited by Bryant, makes Abaddon to be the same as the Grecian Python. It is not to be doubted that the Pythian Apollo is that evil spirit whom the Hebrews call Obi and Abaddon, the Hellenists, Apollyon, and the other Greeks, Apollo. This is corroborated by the testimony of St. John, who says, They had a king over them which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek, Hellenistic, tongue hath his name Apollyon too. This same angel of the bottomless pit is in another place called by the evangelist, the dragon, that old serpent which is the devil and Satan 3. Subject to the king of Babylon was Assyria, and the people of this country are said to have borne a dragon upon their standard 4. It is observed by Bryant that in most countries the original military standard was descriptive of the deity they worshipped. It is certain that the Roman soldiers paid great veneration to their military insignia, almost amounting to worship, from which we may infer that the devices on them were, originally, emblems of the gods. Their chief ensign, the eagle, was sacred to Jupiter. From the practice of the Romans, we may obtain an insight into that of the other nations of antiquity, for in matters of superstition it is astonishing how nearly people, geographically the most remote, approached each other. From the Assyrians, the emperors of Constantinople are said to have borrowed the dragon standard 1. The same standard was also borne by the Parthians 2, Scythians 3, Saxons 4, Chinese, Danes 5, and Egyptians, people who were in a greater or less degree addicted to serpent worship. We may therefore infer that the dragon ensign of the Assyrians denoted their devotion to the same idolatry. 2. Persia. The serpent worship of Persia is more noticed by authors than that of Babylonia. The Dracontic standard distinguished the Persians as well as the Assyrian, for among the spoils taken by Aurelian from Zenobia were Persia's Dracones 1, which were doubtless military ensigns, for the Persians assisted the queen of Palmyra on that occasion. This, according to our hypothesis, would denote that the Persians venerated the serpent, an inference which is abundantly proved from their mythology. In the mythology of Persia we may look for the remnant of the ancient Chaldean philosophy, and in proportion as we establish the prevalence of Ophiolotria in Persia, in the same proportion, at least, we may infer that it once obtained in Babylon. So strongly marked was this character of idolatry in the Persian religion that Eusebius does not hesitate to affirm. They all worship the first principles under the form of serpents, having dedicated to them temples in which they performed sacrifices, and held festivals and orgies, esteeming them the greatest of gods, and governors of the universe 1. The first principles were Ormuzd and Armun, the good and evil deity, whose contention for the universe was represented in Persian mythology by 2 serpents contending for the mundane egg. They are standing upon their tails, and each of them has fastened upon the object in dispute with his teeth. The egg for which they contend represented the universe in the mythologies of India, Egypt, and Persia. An engraving of this may be seen in Mafu Khan. But the evil principle was more particularly represented by the serpent, as we may infer from a fable in the Zendavesta, in which the deity is described as having assumed a serpent's form to destroy the first of the human species, whom he accordingly poisoned to. A similar proof occurs in the Satyr 3, where we find the following precept: When you kill serpents, you shall repeat the Zendavesta, and thence you will obtain great merit, for it is the same as if you had killed so many devils. The Zendavesta to be here repeated might, perhaps, be that portion of it above alluded to the assumption of the serpent's form by Armun, connected with which, doubtless, was the popular belief of the Persians that in the place of torment in the other world, scorpions and serpents gnaw and sting the feet of the wicked one. The god Mithras was represented encircled by a serpent, and in his rites a custom was observed similar to that practiced in the mysteries of Sabazius 2. A serpent was thrown into the bosom of the initiated, and taken out the lower parts of his garments 3. In Mafu Khan, Volume 5, are some plates of Mithras, with a lion's head and a human body, and round him is coiled a large winged serpent. In the supplement to Volume 1, Mafu Khan gives us a representation of a stone found at Lyons. It is a rude stone, exhibiting the head of a young and beardless man. Under it is the inscription, Eo Invicto Mither, Secundinastat, and under the inscription, the raised figure of a large serpent. Mithras was styled Invictus, and often represented with a youthful countenance, like that of Apollo. Mandelso, who visited an ancient temple at Mardis, saw in one of the recesses a square pillar, with the figure of a king upon it, worshipping the sun, fire, and a serpent 1. On the front of some ancient Persian grottos, sacred to the solar deity, was figured a princely personage approaching an altar, on which the sacred fire is burning. Above all is the sun, and the figure of the deity in a cloud, with sometimes a sacred bandage, at other times a serpent entwined round his middle too. This is the god Azan, whose name, according to Bryant, signifies the sun. The sacred girdle round his waist was esteemed an emblem of the orbit described by Zone, sun. Hence girdles were called by the Greeks, zones 3. This deity is sometimes represented differently as a young man in profile, round whose waist is drawn a ring loosely dependent. Through the lower part of this ring passes a serpent. At the upper limb of the circle, behind the figure, is a kind of mantle, composed of expanded wings. In Coemphor's Amenet, Exot, the same deity is described in a third form. He appears terminating at the waist in a circle, which is composed of a serpent. From each side of this circle proceed 4 wings. In his left hand he holds another circle, or ring, composed, like the former, of a serpent biting his own tail. This painting was of Persepolis. Here is also, in Coemphor, p. 312, a figure of a priest of this god, who appears to be approaching an altar with a serpent in his left hand. In the sky above is a representation of his deity, and behind the god is the sun. The hierogram of the circle wings and serpent is one of the most curious emblems of Ophiolatria, and may be recognized in almost every country where serpent worship prevailed. It forms a prominent feature in the Persian, Egyptian, and Mexican hieroglyphics. China, Hindustan, Greece, Italy, and Asia Minor, as distinctly, though more rarely, exhibit it, and it has even been found in Britain. It seems to have been a general symbol of consecration, and as such is alluded to by the poet Persius, Pinge duos angs, pueri sacer est locus. Sat. I. 113. Here 2 snakes are mentioned, which is the hierogram of the worshippers of the 2 principles, each of whom is represented by a serpent. Often, however, only one serpent appears issuing from the winged circle, and sometimes the circle is shorn of its wings. As a symbol of consecration, the Hittite hierogram appears over the portals of the Egyptian temples, and may be recognized even in those of Java. The Druids, however, with the consistent magnificence which characterized their religion, transferred the symbol from the portal to the whole temple, and instead of placing the circle and serpent over the entrance into their sanctuaries, erected the entire building itself in the form of the Hittite hierogram. Aberry in Wiltshire and Stanton Drew in Somersetshire are interesting examples of this construction. The former represents the Hittite hierogram with 1 serpent, the latter with 2, the circle in each case being destitute of wings. On the ruins of Nakhiristan, in Persia, is a beautiful specimen of the serpent and winged circle. In Egypt the hierogram underwent various transformations, of which the annexed plate gives a description. One of them, number 2, is perhaps the device from which Malachi borrowed his elegant metaphor of the Son of Righteousness arising with healing in his wings. Selden remarks the figure in abbreviated writing among the Greeks signified delta alpha iota mu omega nu, the deity 1. The same figure, according to Kircher, was in use among the Brahmins of Hindustan, as the character mundi intelligibilis 2, that is, of the deity, for the universe and its creator were often confounded by the ancient heathen. The emblem is evidently the globe and serpents of Egyptian mythology. In the same form was erected the celebrated temple of the Druids at Aberry in Wiltshire. The upright stones which constituted the adytum and its approaches correctly delineated the circle, with the serpent passing through it 3. In China, this sacred emblem assumed a form unknown in other countries. The serpents were separated from the annulus, being placed on each side of it, regarding each other. This was probably a representation of the 2 principles claiming the universe. This sacred ring between 2 serpents is very common on the triumphal arches of Pekin. In Table 15 of Baron Vischer's Ancient Architecture 1 is an engraving of such an arch, and on it is this hierogram twice depicted. But the most remarkable of all is the Mexican symbol. Here the 2 serpents intertwining form the circle with their own bodies, and in the mouth of each of them is a human head. A similar figure was assumed by the Hittite hierogram when it appeared on the staff of Mercury and constituted the caduceus. The serpents intertwining formed the circle. The origin of this symbol is to be found in the deification of the serpent of paradise. Its real meaning is involved in much mystery. In the former edition of this treatise I advanced the opinion that it meant nothing more than the winged serpent once coiled. But further consideration has induced me to give up this conjecture as irreconcilable with the connection of the serpent and globe. The most probable meaning may be that which I have assigned in the chapter on serpent temples, namely, that it is the hierogram of the solar Hittite god Ophel or Apollo, and assumed its present shape from the union of the 2 idolatries of the serpent and the sun. For the grounds of this conjecture I refer to the chapter cited. At all events it is certain that the tripartite emblem of the serpent, wings, and circle was an hieroglyphic of the deity, and this is sufficient for the purposes of my argument. The Egyptian priests of a later and more metaphysical age, understanding this to be the signification of the hierogram, addressed themselves to the task of discovering the mystery. A most ingenious theory was accordingly devised by Hermes Trismegistus, who was probably the high priest of the god Thoth, or thrice great Hermes, whose name he assumed in compliance with the universal custom of the religion. The god Thoth was believed to have been the author of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. According to this theory, the globe typified the simple essence of God, which he indifferently called the Father, the first mind, the supreme wisdom. The serpent emerging from the globe was the vivifying power of God, which called all things into existence. This he named the Word. The wings implied the moving or penetrative power of God, which pervaded all things. This he called love. The whole emblem was interpreted to represent the Supreme Being in his character of Creator and Preserver One. The definition of the deity by Trismegistus is poetically sublime. God is a circle whose center is everywhere, and circumference nowhere. To the above description of the Hittite hierogram, as may well be imagined, has persuaded many an ardent friend of revelation to recognize in this symbol of the hieroglyphical learning of Egypt, the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Kircher, Cudworth, and Maurice have all embraced this opinion, but the more cautious Faber III, with the arguments of all before him, has come to the conclusion that the doctrine of the Trinity, in its Christian sense, was unknown to the pagans, that there has been but one essential religion among the servants of the living God, from the fall to the present hour, no reasonable reader of the Holy Scriptures can deny. There never has been a time in which true religion has been wholly lost. Some few, if not 7,000, have always been left who have not bowed the knee to Baal. But for these few, who have had a right knowledge and clear conception of the deity as revealed to Adam, we must look among the holy remnant, who were at one time confined to the family of Noah, and at another to that of Abraham. The rapidity with which the descendants of Noah fell into polytheism forbids our being too sanguine in the hope of discovering the doctrine of the Trinity among the Gentiles. This doctrine itself, corruptly remembered, perhaps gave rise to that very polytheism which at length obliterated almost every trace of rational religion in the world. If then the globe, wings, and serpent was among the Egyptians the hieroglyphic of the Trinity, we must suppose that the priests acquired this doctrine from their intercourse with the Israelites, rather than from any tradition of their ancestors. In this case, Joseph would be the Hermes Trismegistus, so lauded in Egyptian history, as Bryant indeed supposes he was. Joseph is said to have taught the Egyptian senators wisdom one, but not, I apprehend, in a religious sense. The Edict of Pharaoh, to which this probably alludes, is of a political nature too. It would have been the extreme of indiscretion for Joseph to have attempted, without a divine command, to instruct the Egyptians in the mysteries of religion, and had such a command been issued, it would have been recorded by Moses. So far from the Egyptians having acquired religious instruction from the Israelites, every journey in the wilderness performed by the latter proves that they learned idolatry from the Egyptians. The golden calf is a memorable instance, as copied from the rites of the sacred ox Apis. Besides, it is more likely that Joseph, in his instructions on the mysteries of religion, would have begun with his own people, who seem not only to have been ignorant of the doctrine of the Trinity, but of every rational idea of the unity of God, when Moses was commissioned to lead them from Egypt. Of this we have abundant proof in the diffidence with which he accepted the commission. 1. So gross was their ignorance and so deep-rooted their prejudices, that the doctrine of the Trinity was never, indeed, fully explained to them, even by Moses. He deemed it a doctrine too dangerous for their idolatrously inclined minds to bear, lest in their ardor for the polytheism which it was his object to eradicate, they should separate the unity, and dishonor the Trinity, lest in their proneness to worship the many, they should forget that Jehovah their God is one Jehovah too. I cannot therefore see that there is any conclusive testimony that the Egyptian hierogram of globe, wings, and serpent denoted the Trinity, in our sense of the term. Indeed, it may be doubted whether the definition of Hermes Trismegistus adduced by Kircher may not have been a pious fraud of some Egyptian Christian of the 2nd or 3rd century, whose imagination seized upon this popular emblem as a fit instrument for inculcating the truth. But, whatever may have been the origin or meaning of this hierogram, one thing is clear, that the serpent attached to it was a type of divinity, and this is enough to support the theory of the present volume, that the serpent of paradise was the serpent god of the Gentiles. 3. Hindustan. As an emblem of divinity, the serpent enters deeply into the religion of the Brahmins, and from the popular superstitions of the present race of Hindus, we may infer that he was at one time an object of religious worship. The well-known reluctance of the natives of Hindustan to kill a snake cannot be referred entirely to the doctrine of transmigration of souls. In Forbes's Oriental Memoirs, we read of certain gardeners in Gujarat who would never suffer the snakes to be molested, calling them father, brother, and other endearing names, and looking upon them as something divine. The head gardener, however, paid them religious honors. 1. Here we observe a mixture of the original serpent worship with the more modern doctrine of transmigration. But a more tangible proof that ophiolatria did indeed exist in Hindustan in former times is furnished in the following fact, noticed in Purchas's Pilgrims. A king of Calicut built cottages for live serpents, whom he tended with peculiar care, and made it a capital crime for any person in his dominions to destroy a snake. The natives looked upon serpents as endued with divine spirits. 1. From some such a notion may have been derived a custom which prevails in certain parts of Hindustan to this day. The natives have a festival called the Feast of the Serpents, at which every Hindu sets by a portion of his rice for the hooded snake on the outside of his house. By this offering he expects to propitiate those reptiles during the remainder of the year. A further proof of the ancient prevalence of ophiolatry in those countries is afforded by the sculptures in the celebrated caverns of Salsette and Elephanta, where the deities either grasp serpents in their hands or are enfolded by them. Serpents are also sculptured on the cornices surrounding the roofs of those caverns, and similarly delineated in the more modern pagodas. 1. The god Sani of the Hindus is represented on a raven and encircled by 2 serpents, whose heads meet over that of the god 2. Maurice supposes that by the serpentine circle over Sani, who is the Saturn of the Hindus, the ring of that planet is denoted. If so, the discoveries of modern astronomy are little more than revivals of the ancient philosophy. But whether Sani be Saturn or the sun, he is equally illustrative of our theory that serpents were early emblems of divinity in Hindustan. As such we find them employed in the religious festivals of the Hindus, 3, symbolizing some of their most awful deities. Buddha and Jain are both adorned with the same emblem. The statue of Jain, who is said to be the Indian Aesculapius, is turbaned by a 7-headed snake. The rim of the pedestal is embossed with serpents' heads. The same serpent also symbolizes Parunath. 1. On a rock in the Ganges, in the province of Bihar, is a sculpture of Vishnu reposing on a coiled serpent, whose numerous folds are made to form a canopy over the sleeping god 2. This serpent is fabled to have been the goddess Devi or Isi, who assumed the figure to carry Vishnu over the waters of the deluge. 3. The sleep of Vishnu indicates the period between the 2 worlds. A similar sculpture is to be seen among the ruins of Mavalipuram, on the coast of Coromandel. 4. Vishnu himself is sometimes represented encompassed in the folds of a serpent, and Twashta, the great artificer of the universe, who corresponds in Hindu mythology with the Kevorta of the Egyptians, is supposed to have borne the form of a serpent. 5. Juggernaut, is said to be sometimes worshipped under the form of a 7-headed dragon. 6. The Hindu Dionysos, the Dionysus of the Greeks, was metamorphosed into a snake. 7. Hence, probably the prominent figure which the serpent bore in the mysteries of Bacchus. Mahadeva, a name of Shiva, is sometimes represented with a snake entwined about his neck, 1 round his hair, armlets of serpents upon both arms. 1. Bhairava, an avatar of Shiva, sits upon the coils of a serpent, whose head rises above that of the god 2. Parvati, the consort of Shiva, is represented with snakes about her neck and waist. 3. Hence we perceive that the serpent was an emblem not confined to one god, but common to many. The 5th day of the bright half of the month Shravana is also sacred to the demigods in the forms of serpents. 4. This reptile, though the attribute of many of the Hindu deities, both benevolent and malignant, belonged more properly to the evil spirit, of whom it is a sacred and terrific emblem. The king of the evil demons is called, in Hindu mythology, the king of the serpents. His name is Naga, and he is the prince of the Nagas, or Nags. In which Sanskrit appellation, observes Maurice, we plainly trace the Hebrew Nahash, which is the very word for the particular serpentine tempter and, in general, for all serpents throughout the Old Testament. 1. The Hindu Naraka, or hell, is fabled to consist of poisonous snakes folded together in horrible contortions. The malignant serpent Kaliya, who was slain by Vishnu, in his incarnation of Krishna, because he poisoned the air, and destroyed the herds on the banks of the Yamuna, was deified and worshipped by the Hindus in the same manner as Python was adored at Delphi. 2. To the evil demon, in the form of a great serpent, the Hindus attributed the guardianship of treasures. A remarkable instance of this superstition occurs in Forbes's Oriental Memoirs. Having once the curiosity to open a vault in a deserted tower, in which treasure was reported to be concealed under the guardianship of a demon in the form of a snake, he prevailed, with much difficulty, upon 2 men to descend, when, in strict accordance with the popular belief, they found a large serpent in a torpid state. The 2 men were drawn up and the reptile destroyed by fire, but nothing could induce the natives again to enter a place, which they now regarded more than ever as the residence of the evil spirit. In Hindustan prevailed, also, the general opinion which accompanied ophiolatria in all its progress that the serpent was of a prophetic nature. 1. The decay of Ophiolotria in Hindustan may be readily accounted for by the exterminating religious wars which so long raged between the followers of Krishna and Buddha. Buddha was the serpent who carried off Ella, the daughter of Ishwaka, the son of Manu, and hence the animosity against him. The children, i.e. the worshippers of Buddha, were the real Hindus, and preserved the Hivites sign of their race. They were distinguished by the banner of a serpent. The worshippers of Krishna adopted the eagle. The worshippers of Krishna, Buddha, and Surya, the sun, formed the three idolatrous classes of India from the Ganges to the Caspian Sea. The children of Surya joined with those of Krishna against the Buddhists, and at length almost exterminated the race. The Mahabharata records constant wars from ancient times between the worshippers of the sun and the Tak or Takshak races. The word Takshak is frequently rendered snake, but Tak is the name of a mountain in the range west of India, and Hawk was the word which designated a serpent. Alexander's ally Taxiles was doubtless an Hittite chief of this country, for he took him to see an enormous dragon, the object of worship among his subjects. The name Taxiles was probably titular, since he was called Onufis until his father's death. He was then the priest and king of the Hivites of Tak, and from that very circumstance called Onufis by the Greeks, who had acquired the knowledge of this title from their intercourse with Egypt, and her priesthood of On and Oph2. Pursuing our inquiries, we find that Ophiolotria prevailed to an equal extent in Kashmir, where there were no less than 700 places in which carved images of serpents were worshipped. And even in Tibet may be often seen, the great Chinese dragon ornamenting the temples of the Grand Lama II. But the chief seats of Ophiolotria in this quarter of the modern world were in China and Japan. 4. Ceylon. The religion of the natives of Ceylon is the Buddha, which is a corruption of the ancient Ophiolotria. The Sinhalese, says Dr. Davy III, in general rather venerate than dread the hooded snake. They conceive that it belongs to another world, and that when it appears in this is only a visitor. They imagine that it possesses great power, and is somewhat akin to the gods, and superior to man. In consequence, they superstitiously refrain from killing it. This is the snake made use of by the serpent charmers. Its image is also seen round the necks of some of the gods. The mythological history of this serpent is curious. They live in the world of spirits in a place peculiarly devoted to themselves, and are said to have a faculty of locomotion, and a splendor of appearance like the gods. Nevertheless, they are supposed to have been once human beings, who forfeited their estate by indulging the sin of malice. V. China and Japan. The great Chinese dragon, so conspicuous in every public and private edifice, was the symbolical serpent of ancient mythology, under a more fanciful and poetic form. It was the genial banner of the empire, and indicated everything that was sacred in it. It was not only the stamp and symbol of royalty, but is sculptured in all the temples, blazoned on the furniture of the houses, and interwoven with the vestments too of the chief nobility. The emperor bears a dragon as his armorial device, and the same figure is engraved on his scepter and diadem, as well as on all the vases of the imperial palace. The dragon is also mixed up with many of their religious legends. The Chinese believe that there is a dragon of extraordinary strength and sovereign power, which is in heaven, in the air, on the waters, and on the mountains. 3. A property so divine must have originated in the attribution of this sacred animal to the creator of the universe. For though it might apply partly to the spiritual presence of the evil one, yet in China this religious emblem belonged rather to the Agatha demon. At the sacred washing of Confucius, soon after his birth, 2 dragons were fabled to have attended one, to intimate probably that the young philosopher was, in an especial manner, under the protection of the deity too. Father Martin, one of the Jesuits who obtained a settlement in China, says that the Chinese delight in mountains and high places, because there lives the dragon upon whom their good fortune depends. They call him the father of happiness. To this dragon they erect temples shaded with groves. 3. Here we perceive the union of 2 primeval superstitions, serpent worship and grove worship, each of them commemorative of the fall in paradise. The Chinese god Fohi is said to have had the form of a man, terminating in the tail of a snake, which is not only a proof of the early existence of serpent worship in China, but also shows that the dragon and the snake of Chinese mythology were cognate. Such a form also had the Athenian Cecrops and Erechtheus, and the Egyptian Typhon 1. There was a remarkable superstition in regard to a serpent of enormous bulk which girded the world, current in the mythology of almost every nation where Ophiolotria prevailed, nor was China exempt from the general credulity. This idea, perhaps, originated in the early consecration of the serpent to the sun, and the subsequent conversion of a serpent biting his tail into an emblem of the sun's path. This hierogram was again considered as typical of eternity, partly from the serpent being a symbol of deity, partly from the perfect figure of a circle thus formed, without beginning or end, and partly from an opinion of the eternity of matter. In countries where the 2 principles were represented by 2 serpents instead of the ecliptic, The solstitial colors were described under these symbols. Thus, in Egyptian hieroglyphics, two serpents intersecting each other at right angles upon a globe denoted the earth. These rectangular intersections were at the solstitial points. 1. The genius of superstition soon resolved the imaginary into real serpents, of which metamorphosis we have an instance in the fictions of the Chinese, who are said to be superstitious in choosing a plot of ground to erect a dwelling house or sepulchre, conferring it with the head, tail, and feet of divers dragons which live under our earth, whence depends all good or bad fortunes too. The same poetical fiction was current in Hindustan, where there is a tradition that the founder of Delhi, when about to lay the foundation of that city, was told by a Brahmin, but provided he placed the seat of his government on the head of the serpent that supports the world, his throne and kingdom would last forever. 3. In Hindu mythology, the serpent Asut enfolds the globe. 1, and on every eclipse the Hindus believe that the sun or moon is seized by a large serpent or dragon. The same notion obtains in China too. This is the imaginary serpent of the constellation Draco, and the superstition may be a remnant of the tradition of the war in heaven, when Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. 3. The dragon and the serpent are the 5th and 6th signs of the Chinese zodiac. The superstition of Japan was in every respect similar to that of China. The dragon was held in equal veneration in both countries. The chronicles and histories of the gods and heroes of Japan are full of fabulous stories of this animal. They believe that it dwells at the bottom of the sea as its proper element. They represent it in their books as a huge, long, 4-footed snake, some of the Japanese emperor's cloth, his arms, scimitars, knives, and the like, as also the furniture and hangings of the imperial palace are adorned with figures of this dragon. 1. The Japanese soldiers eat the flesh of the serpent called fitakuts, believing firmly that it has the virtue of making them bold and courageous. 2. There is reason to believe that temple worship was formerly paid to the dragon in Japan. Koan, for being once on a journey, a temple was pointed out to him which, his guides said, had been erected in memory of a victory gained on the shores of the Lake Oits by a famous dragon over a scolopendra. 3. Burma. The neighboring countries of Siam and Burma, partaking with the Chinese in the religion of Buddha, partook with them also in the adoration of the serpent. Such, at least, was the case in former times. I have a Burmese illuminated manuscript in my possession, exhibiting, apparently in the successive order of events, the life of some deity, probably Goatman. One of the first pictures in the series represents this good genius attacked by the evil spirit. The next compartment presents 2 men with a basket hanging from a pole between them, and proceeding through a wood, as if on an important errand. We see the same men, with the same basket, in the next picture. It is now deposited on the ground, and the 2 bearers upon their knees, in the attitude of supplication, before an enormous dragon enveloped in flames. On a mound before him are 2 trees, and the votaries hold up each a bough in his hand. Adoration is unquestionably intended in this representation, and, reasoning from the connection of this picture with the preceding, which describes the assault of the evil spirit upon the passive and praying image of the good demon, we cannot be charged with extraordinary credulity if we refer the whole to some dark tradition respecting the events in paradise. The attitude of the 2 worshippers of the dragon, and the boughs in their hands, illustrate the scene in the beginning of the Oedipus Tyrannus of Sophocles, where the attendants of the priest of Thebes appear, Kappa Tau Eta Rho Omicron Iota Sigma Kappa Lambda Delta Omicron Iota Sigma Iota Nu Xi Epsilon Sigma Tau Epsilon Mu Mu Nu Omicron Iota, with the boughs of supplication in their hands. The scene is at Thebes in a fight city. 7. Java. A worship compounded of the Brahminical and Buddhist superstitions, prevailed originally in Java. Sir Stamford Raffles, in exploring the ruined temples, found many images which were adorned with the sacred serpent. Gigantic figures, placed at the portals, were armed with a club in one hand, and a writhing snake in the other. Small twisted snakes also formed their armlets, and one, passing diagonally across the body, represented a belt. 1. In the temple of Ketil is an idol, on one side of which are 3 serpents of an enormous magnitude, intertwining over the head of the image. A female figure, with a serpent also reclines over it too. Over the portal of the great temple of Chandi Su is a very large and terrible gorgon visage. 3. These gorgon visages are not uncommon, and are probably a form of the Hittite hierogram, denoting consecration, such as we see over the portals of some of the Egyptian temples. All the Javanese temples are pyramidal, which is a figure dedicated to the solar deity, and the same gorgon visages, as emblems of consecration, appear over the niches which contain the images. The symbolical serpent, at least, was therefore once worshipped in Java. 8. Arabia. Returning towards the center and source of Ophiolatria, we arrive in Arabia, and here also are traces, though almost obliterated, of the ancient serpent worship. Of the Kaaba of Mecca as connected with this idolatry, we shall have occasion to speak hereafter. But in this place we may observe that the language of the country retains an expression of its original religion, which is not a little remarkable. The same word is employed to denote both adoration and the serpent, from whence Dickinson infers that the Arabians formerly worshipped serpents. 1. We may observe, also, that Philostratus too attributes the same superstitious practice, with the same views, to the natives of Arabia and Hindustan, viz. That of eating the heart and liver of serpents, for the purpose of acquiring a knowledge of the thoughts and languages of animals. This notion, perhaps, originated in the traditionary account of the prophetic serpent, the memory of whose oracle is so strongly impressed upon the page of antiquity. 9. Syria. From Arabia we pass into the land of Canaan, for so many ages the theater upon which truth and superstition contended for the ascendancy. The country which we include under the general name of Syria extends from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean Sea, on one side, and from Mount Taurus to Arabia, on the other. It includes, therefore, the whole of Phoenicia and Palestine, the territories of Damascus, and the possessions of Solomon. The Phoenicians, according to Sanchoniaton, cited by Eusebius I, were among the earliest of the nations that embraced ophiolatria, and the author of this idolatry is said to have been Taotus. Sanchoniaton calls him a god too, and says that he first made an image of Celis and afterwards of Saturn, and then invented hieroglyphics. 3. He is supposed to be the same as the Hermes Trismegistus of Egypt, where there was called Thoth, and deified. The words of Sanchoniaton are the following: Taotus consecrated the species of dragons and serpents, and the Phoenicians and Egyptians followed him in this superstition. Hence we may infer that Taotus was the first person who introduced into Phoenicia both Sabaism and serpent worship, for such must be the meaning of the expressions that he was the first who made an image of Celis, that is, represented the heavenly host by visible symbols, and consecrated dragons and serpents. The union of these two superstitions, intimated by the attribution of them to the same inventor, proves the origin of the serpent worship to be coordinate with that of the sun, or of the celestial bodies. From which we may argue that Taotus was the leader of the first colony after the flood which settled in Phoenicia, out of which he may have passed easily into Egypt, if we take the word Phoenicia in its most extended sense, as including the whole land of Canaan. There is then no difficulty in conceiving that the Phoenician Thoth and the Egyptian Thoth were the same person. The intimate connection of the latter with the serpent worship of Egypt we shall observe in the sequel. The prevalence of ophiolatria in the land of Canaan is therefore directly shown upon historical testimony. It is proved collaterally by the traditions of the country, and the remains of serpent worship which was occasionally visible in the sacred and classical writings. The name of the sacred serpent, according to Bryant I, who has taken great pains to arrive at accuracy in this statement, was in the ancient language of Canaan, variously pronounced Ab, Ob, Ob, Oph, Up, Eph, Ev, all referable to the original, or, which being derived from inflare, was, perhaps, applied to the serpent from his peculiarity of inflation when irritated. The first oracle mentioned in history was dedicated to the serpent god, who was known in Canaan by the name of Obi or Alp. Hence arose the notion that the oracular response of the priestess of these serpent temples must be always preceded by a mysterious inflation, as if actuated by the internal presence of the divine spirit. Thus Virgil describes the Pythian priestess, 8 Deus, Ecce Deus, Coitalia Fondi, Pectus Anhelum, et Rabe Feracorda Tument, Major Quideri, Nec Mortale Sonans, ad flata est numen quando jam perpior de. Aeneid. I. 46 and the whole of this notion of necessary inflation was taken up by the Greeks, from mistaking the word Ob, the name of the deity, for the word Ob, that property of inflation, from whence the name was derived, Ob signifying both a serpent, and his property of inflation 1. The first mention of the god Ob occurs in the scriptures. Moses refers to his oracle, when he commands every Ab, or Ob, to be put to death. A man also or woman, that hath a familiar spirit, shall surely be put to death. Levit. 20. 27. Duke. 18. 1.1 The word is translated by the Septuagint, ventriloquist, one that speaks from his belly. This is the Greek notion of inflation, adopted by the Septuagint in accommodation to the received opinions respecting the Pythian priestess. The English version, who hath a familiar spirit, is too indefinite, and the Septuagint, who is a ventriloquist, too paraphrastic, to express the meaning of Moses. We must therefore look for another. In doing so, we may remark that it was not an unusual custom of the Gentiles for the priest or priestess of any god to take the name of the deity they served. Thus Clemens Alexandrinus calls the priest of Knuphis in Egypt, Psychnophis. This was the priest with whom Plato conversed one, and his god was the same as the Obi of Canaan, that is, the serpent god of the country. We read also of Eunuphus, a priest of Heliopolis, from whom Pythagoras is said to have learned astronomy too. Heliopolis, the city of the sun, was called in Egypt On, which was a title of the solar deity. Eunuphus therefore, or rather Eunuphus, was the solar deity On, symbolized by the sacred serpent Oph. In this case therefore, as in the former, the priest assumed the cognomen of his god. Again, Eutychus was taught astronomy by another priest of Heliopolis, whose name was Canufus, or Canufus I. For these examples I am indebted to Jablonski, who says that Canufus means literally Seich Canufus, the servant of the god Canufus. In like manner we find that the priestess of Delphi was called Pythia, from her deity Python, and the druid who was the minister of the British god who was called an adder, because adders were symbolical of the god whom he served, whose chief title was Hu, the dragon ruler of the world too. It is a curious coincidence that as the witch of Endor is called Ob, and the African sorceress Obi, from the serpent deity Ob, so the Old English name of a witch, hag, bears apparent relationship to the word hawk, the ancient British name of a species of snake. These examples I have taken exclusively from the worshippers of the serpent god in Egypt, Greece, and Britain, among whom the custom seems to have been more prevalent than among the votaries of the other heathen deities. To these we may add the example of the emperor Elagabalus assuming the name of the Syrian god of Emesa, at whose shrine he officiated before he was invested with the Roman purple. We shall find in the sequel that this deity was identical, or nearly so, with the deity whose worship we are now investigating, the difference being that Obi was simply the serpent god, whereas Elagabalus was the solar deity symbolized by the serpent. From these parallels we may infer that the priest or priestess of Obi in Canaan assumed the appellation of the deity whom they served. We may therefore render Levin 20:27 a man also or woman among you who is an Obi, i.e. a priest or priestess of Obi, shall be surely put to death, and similarly endued. 18:11. The expression, a consulter with familiar spirits, may be rendered a consulter of the priests of Obi. Again, a woman of Endor, to whom Saul applied for an oracle, is called, the literal meaning of which is one that hath Obi, which is synonymous with a priestess of Obi. The serpent Obi, thus worshipped in Canaan as oracular, was called a good demon, as we learn from Eusebius, citing Sanchoniaton. The nations called this animal the sacred serpent, Agatha demon. The Egyptians likewise called him Knef, and added to him the head of a hawk, because of its activity. 1. The title Obi, or Ab, was frequently compounded with On, the name of the sun, because the serpent was considered symbolical of that deity. This symbolical worship was of very ancient date in Phoenicia, as we learn from Sanchoniaton II, who tells us, the son of Thabian was the first hierophant of Phoenicia. Prophets and priests are frequently called in mythology the sons of the god whom they worshipped. The son of Thabian therefore was the priest of Thabian. Now Thabian is a compound word, th-abion, of which the initial letters th signify God. They are an abbreviation of the word theith, from which the Greeks formed theta epsilon omicron sigma, which with the nation was the most general name of the deity. 3. Thabian therefore implies the god Abian, the serpent solar god. The primitive serpent worshippers of Canaan against whom Moses cautioned the children of Israel were the Hivites. This word, according to Bashar 1, is derived from hivia, a serpent, the root of which is F or Ivan of the variations of the original out. Hivites or Hivites, being aspirated, would become Hivites or Hivites, whence comes the word Hivites, by which the Greek historians designated the worshippers of the serpent. The Greek word omicron phi iota sigma, serpent, is derived from Oph, the Egyptian name for that reptile too, the same as F. The Hivites who were left to prove Israel 3, inhabited Mount Lebanon, from Mount Balarman unto the entering in of Hamath. The children of Israel intermarried with them, and served their gods. These were called Baalim, which being in the plural number, may mean the god Baal or Bel, under different forms of worship, of which that of the serpent was one, as we have seen under the article Ophialatria in Babylon. The extent to which this worship prevailed may be estimated by the fact of its surviving to the time of Hezekiah, when the Jews burned incense to the brazen serpent which had been laid up among the sacred relics, as a memorial of their deliverance from the serpents in the wilderness. Hezekiah removed the high places and cut down the groves, and brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made, for unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it, and he called it Nehustan 1, I.e. a piece of brass, by way of contempt. But the worship of the serpent was not so easily suppressed in Canaan. The Jewish polity being broken up, the lurking Hivites crept out of their obscurity, and in the 2nd century brought dishonor on the Christian religion, by claiming an affinity of faith with the worshippers of Jesus. These Christian heretics were exposed by Epiphanius II under the name of Omicron Phi Tau Alpha Iota. Clemens Alexandrinus also mentions them, and Tertullian describes their tenets accesserunt his heretici etiam Chiaphite, Nucupanter, nam serpentem magnificent in tantum ut illum etiam ipsi Christo preferent. Ipse enim inquent scienti nobis boni et mali originum dedit, ujus animadvertens potentiam et majestate, moisesareum posuit serpentum, et quicunc in eam aspexerunt, sanitatum consecuti sunt. Ipse aint praeterea, in evangelio imitator serpentis ipsius sacrum potestatum dicendo et sicut Moises exaltavit serpentem in deserto, ida exaltari oportet filium hominis. Ipsum introducant ad benedis and de Eucharistia 1. A more ingenious perversion of scripture than the foregoing may scarcely be found in the annals of heresy. Epiphanius says that the Hivites sprung out of the Nicolaitans and Gnostics, and were so called from the serpent which they worshipped. The Gnostics, he informs us in another place too, taught that the ruler of this world was of a draconic form. The Hivites, he observes, attribute all wisdom to the serpent of paradise, and say that he was the author of knowledge to men. They keep a live serpent in a chest, and at the time of the mysteries entice him out by placing bread before him upon a table. Opening his door he comes out, and having ascended the table, folds himself about the bread. This they call a perfect sacrifice. They not only break and distribute this among the votaries, but whosoever will, may kiss the serpent one. This the wretched people call the Eucharist. They conclude the mysteries by singing in him through him to the Supreme Father too. The above account of Epiphanius forcibly reminds us of the mysteries of Bacchus, in which serpents were carried in covered baskets, and in which cakes and new bread were given to the votaries. Demosthenes, in one of his most splendid passages of sarcasm, describes his antagonist Aeschines under the ludicrous character of a Bacchans, pressing tight in his hands the Parian serpents, and brandishing them over his head, and shouting "Euoi, say boy!" Dancing meantime, and crying "His Ates! Ates his!" He calls him, contemptuously, a chief leader of the mysteries and chest-bearer, that is, carrying the snake basket. For which extravagancies he receives his reward in cakes and new bread 1. In the Bacchanalian mysteries, also, there was a consecrated cup of wine, handed round after supper, called the cup of the Agatha demon, which was received with much shouting too. The Christian Hivites, therefore, preserving the memory of their Bacchanalian orgies, would naturally confound the observances of the Lord's Supper with the practices incident to their heathen festival. The hymn with which they concluded their idolatrous ceremonies, addressed through the serpent to the Supreme Father, is a memorial of the hymn sung to Python on every seventh day at Delphi 3. These opinions of the Gnostic Hivites were blended with the old Magian superstition of Persia by Manes, a celebrated heretic of the 3rd century, who revived Ophialatria in his native country under the name of Christianity. He taught that Christ was an incarnation of the great serpent, who glided over the cradle of the Virgin Mary when she was asleep, at the age of a year and a half. 1. Traces of Ophialatria are visible in the neighborhood of Damascus, where there were 2 Hittite temples converted, with the usual license of poets, into dragons too. The whole region of Trachonitis is supposed by Bryant to have received its name from the worship of the dragon, so common in those parts. The mistake of tau rho alpha chi omega nu for delta rho alpha kappa omega nu is easy. The subject of Hittite temples is so full of curious information that I shall reserve what I have gleaned upon it for a separate chapter. We may remark, however, in this place, that there is reason for supposing that the celebrated grove of Daphne, near Antioch, was, at least in part, devoted to the mysteries of the serpent. Its consecration to Apollo, the solar god of antiquity, who united in his rites the worship of the serpent, gives countenance to this opinion, but the corroboration is derived from a remarkable legend preserved in Strabo. It is said that the Macedonian kings of Syria first established the oracles, and planted the grove of Daphne 1, but the legend in question would argue for that secluded and voluptuous sanctuary a much higher antiquity. The Macedonian kings, in all probability, patronized the ancient grove worship mentioned in Judges 3:7 in connection with the service of Balaam, into which the children of Israel were seduced by the Hivites. The legend of Strabo informs us that the original name of the river Orontes was Typhon, for though the serpent Typhon, being struck by the lightning of Jupiter, in escaping cut the earth with his body as he writhed along, and springs of water issuing from the ground, formed the river, which, after him, was called Typhon too. Had Ophialatria never existed in Daphne, such a legend as this would hardly have been recorded of the river which flowed by it. At Daphne there was a temple of Apollo, a grove sacred to Diana, and it is a remarkable circumstance that in almost every place where there was either some legend of a serpent generally prevailed. The serpent worship of Syria is strongly marked in the religion of the people of Tyre. The Phoenicians of Tyre consecrated an image of the serpent and suspended it in their temples, encircling in its folds the mundane egg one, the symbol of the universe. The serpent denoted the supreme being, in his character of the vivifying principle. Macrobius informs us that the Phoenicians worshipped Janus under the figure of a serpent, forming a circle, with his tail in his mouth, typifying the self-existence and eternity of the world too. The serpent was deemed particularly sacred to Aesculapius, and in his temples live serpents were kept for the purposes of adoration. There was a grove of Aesculapius near Sidon, on the banks of the Tamiris III, from which we may infer that here also were kept live serpents, and worshipped. The emperor Elagabalus was high priest of the god of that name, who had a temple at Emesa. He imported into Rome small serpents of the Egyptian breed, which were called in that country agathidemons. These he worshipped one. Hence we may infer that this young emperor had been educated in the mysteries of Ophiolatria, an inference which is strengthened by the decomposition of his name, or rather that of his god. Elegable is perhaps Log-obel, that is, the god Og, the serpent god Du. This was the deity whose worship was conveyed into Western Europe under the title of Om or Ogemius by the Phoenician mariners, and established in Gaul and Ireland, as we shall see in the chapters which treat of serpent worship in those countries. He was a compound character between Hercules and Mercury, bearing as his symbol the club of the former, surmounted by the caduceus of the latter. The first mention of this name in history is in the scriptures, where it appears as the cognomen of the celebrated king of Bashan, overthrown by Joshua. He reigned over the territory of Argob III, which was afterwards called by the Greeks Trachonitis. Trachonitis we have already resolved into the country of the dragon, and the propriety of this resolution will appear from decomposing the word Argob into its component parts, Arogob, of which the first signifies light, the second is the name of the deity, the third that of his symbol, the serpent. Faber thinks that Og is the deluge deified, whence is derived Oc and Oceanus. This, I believe, is the general opinion. But whoever Og may have been, the word Argob is his title, and this title bears allusion to the solar deity Aur, and the serpent deity Alp, and the region of Argob in his holy land. Upon this hypothesis the king of Bashan, Og, would be hierarch and king of Argob, assuming the name of his tutelar god Rex Annius, Rex idem hominum, Phoebique sacerdos. Sanford, Dickinson, Vossius, and Gale concur in identifying Og, king of Bashan, with the Typhon or Python of mythology 1. I cannot say that the same arguments which weighed with these learned men have brought me to the same conclusion, but this much cannot, I think, be denied: that there is a strong connection between the worship of Og and Ophiolatria. Beyond this, I would not desire to press the argument, but up to this point I would urge it. For even upon the supposition of Og being the deluge, the serpent would be his emblem, being in this character considered in all mythology Asiatic, Egyptian, or Scandinavian. Elagabalus, therefore, was probably the same at Emesa as Og, the king of Bashan, and Argob the royal priest of the serpent solar god. But the serpent worship of Syria has left stronger records of its original prevalence than verbal coincidences. The coins of the Tyrians, as engraved in Maurice's Indian Antiquities, Volume 6, bear testimony to the existence and prevalence of this superstition in Phoenicia, in characters which it is impossible to mistake. It is true that these medals are of comparatively recent date, the oldest of them being posterior to Alexander the Great, but still they recognize the local superstition of that era, and we know that the local religions of the Asiatics were rarely susceptible of innovation. Besides, we have already possessed ourselves of data which identify Ophiolatria as indigenous in the land of Canaan. The following is a description of these interesting medals. Number 1 represents a tree between two rude stones, which are erect. Round the trunk of the tree is coiled a serpent. At the lower part of the medal, in one corner, is an altar, denoting that the medal is descriptive of religious rites. The two rude stones are the Petrae Ambrosi, so well known to antiquaries, and of the kind of which the Celtic temples were composed. The two stones here are intended, doubtless, as a representation of a Nephite temple. Number 2 represents a burning altar. Two serpents are rising from the two front angles of the base. On the left is the celebrated caduceus, without wings. Number 3 exhibits a naked man standing between two serpents, which are erect upon one coil, and turning from him. This is a medal of Berytus, the rest are Tyrian. Number 4 represents the Tyrian Hercules, Ogemius, contending with a serpent. The man has a large stone in his right hand and is in the act of throwing it. The serpent is erect upon one coil. Behind the man is a seashell, denoting Tyre. Number 5 presents us with a very large Petra ambrosia, round which is entwined a large serpent in a defensive posture. On the right is a seashell, on the left a palm tree. Number 6 represents an altar with a burning sacrifice. In front is a serpent with a radiated head, gazing upon the altar. Besides these medals there is a Tyrian coin engraved in Bryant's analysis, Plate 7. Volume 3. In this we observe a tree between two Petrae Ambrosi. A serpent is twined about the trunk of a tree. At the base of the coin is a seashell and a wolf, emblems of Tyre. The serpent worship of Phoenicia, thus clearly proved, is further illustrated by the very accurate tradition of the rebellion and fall of Satan from heaven, preserved in the legend of Aphionius. Aphionius was a giant who headed an insurrection in heaven against the gods, and being overcome, was cast down to earth. The name of this celestial rebel is compounded of OPH and anon. It was the name of the serpent solar god, who united in his mysteries the two ancient superstitions of Zebaism and Ophiolatria. The celestial origin of Satan is preserved in the termination of his name, on, while his paradisiacal incarnation is intimated in the first syllable, OPH. This deity was probably the Thabian of whom we spoke above. So accurately did the legend of Aphionius coincide with the history of Satan, that Celsus, the champion of paganism, adduced it as a proof that the account of Moses was borrowed from the fables of the heathens. An accusation which is triumphantly answered by Origen I, who charges his opponent with gross ignorance of antiquity, in supposing the fables of his own corrupt mythology to be more ancient than the writings of Moses. Ex Asia Minor. So universal was Ophiolatria in this part of the Roman Empire, that a female figure, holding a serpent in her right hand, and in her left the rostrum of a ship, was the symbol of Asia too. But the provinces of Asia Minor, which exhibited the strongest and most unquestionable vestiges of serpent worship, were Phrygia and Troas. At Hierapolis in Phrygia, a living serpent of great size was kept and worshipped, when Philip the Apostle converted the inhabitants to Christianity. The tradition is that he destroyed this animal by his prayers and the people, overpowered by the miracle, embraced the gospel. As a genius loci, the serpent entered deeply into the religion of the Phrygians. An example of this may be seen in the 5th Aeneid of Virgil, in the sacrifices of Aeneas at the tomb of Anchises. The libations of wine, new milk, and sacred blood, having been poured out, the pious son proceeds with reverential feeling to address the departed spirit of his father, but the scarcely commenced requiem is interrupted by a phenomenon, which fills him, at first, with unmixed astonishment, and then overwhelms him with religious awe. A large and beautiful serpent glides from the tumulus, ascends the altars, consumes the offerings, and returns to his abode. The Trojan, upon recovering his self-possession, immediately concludes that this beautiful and mysterious visitant must either be the tutelary deity of the place, or the attendant minister of his father's soul, incertus genium ne loci, famulum ve parentis. Under either possibility, he hesitates not to offer to the holy being the tribute of adoration. 2 sheep, 2 sows, and 2 bullocks attest his piety with their sacrificial blood. That the Phrygians were Hivites is to be inferred from the device upon the shield of Hector, as represented on the Canino vases 1. The vase no. Mixii discovers Hector setting out to fight with Achilles. He bears a serpent upon his shield. He is again represented with the same device on another vase. As a genius loci, however, the serpent was not confined to Phrygia and Troas. It was, in this character, stamped upon the coins and medals of many towns of Asia Minor. Cyzicum, Pergamus, Marcianopolis, in Mysia, Abonetichos and Amastris in Paphlagonia, Nice and Nicomedia in Bithynia, Tomos and Dionysopolis in Pontus and Myndus in Caria, exhibit as their ensign the sacred serpent too. On the medals of Troas, Nicomedia, Amastris, and Myndus, the serpent is seen encircling a prophetic tripod, on which Spanheim remarks that serpents were not only the common symbols of the Pythian worship, but also the domestic prophets of these places. Other traces of Ophiolatria may be recognized in the names of many places in Asia Minor. As in the names of the ancient cities may be frequently discovered those of the gods to whose worship they were peculiarly devoted, and as the title of the sacred serpent, Ab, or Pethin, is frequently involved in the local designations of Asia Minor, Bryant concluded that the superstition of Ophiolatria must have generally prevailed through this idolatrous region. An island of the Propontis was called Ophiusa. This name was common to many islands and places, and denoted, according to Bryant, their former addiction to the worship of the serpent OPH. In the present case, this hypothesis may seem to be corroborated by the fact that on the opposite point of the Asiatic continent, there prevailed a tradition of a serpent race of Phyogeny, who were said to be descendants of a father, who was formerly changed from a serpent into a man one. The locus of this legend was called Parium, whence, perhaps, the Greeks may have derived the epithet pi alpha rho epsilon iota alpha iota, which was bestowed upon the serpents of the Bacchanalian mysteries. The usual interpretation of this word, from the swelling cheeks of the reptile when irritated, is less probable. Elion 1 also speaks of a race of Aphiogeny in Phrygia, the offspring of a dragon sacred to Diana, and a woman who accidentally entered the grove. Uniting these fables, we may draw the conclusion that a colony of Hivites, migrating from Phrygia, settled at Peria. Strabo supposes that they were the Scilly of Africa, so famous for the art of charming serpents, but adduces no reason or authority for the hypothesis. Besides these inferential evidences of serpent worship, we have more certain ones in the records of authentic history, which have fixed the temples of Apollo and Aesculapius in various cities of Asia Minor. We may remark that the serpent invariably entered into the mysteries of the Pythian worship, and that live serpents were p. 104 always preserved in the sanctuaries of Aesculapius. There is therefore strong reason for believing that wherever there was a temple to either of these deities, Ophiolatria, in some modification, existed. Pythian games 1 were held at Tralles, Miletus, Magnesia, Side, and Perga, all in Asia Minor. Chalcedon, Crissa, and Patara were celebrated for the temples which were dedicated in them to Apollo. The most celebrated temple of Aesculapius in Asia Minor was at Pergamus II, and all the Pergamian coins, according to Spanheim, bore the figure of a serpent. The Aesculapian worship may be traced in several other places in this country, but to avoid prolixity, I relinquish the search to the more curious and minute investigator. Enough has been said on the local indications of Ophiolatria to establish the point that vestiges of the superstition may be found in Asia Minor. But before we take leave of this interesting region, there are two places which demand, though in different degrees, our attention, as memorable abodes of the sacred serpent Kolchos and Abonedichos. The story of the Colchian dragon, overcome by Jason, is too well known to require, in this place, a particular narration. It relates to the destruction of a Nephite temple and would be better deferred to a subsequent chapter, which will treat exclusively on that part of our subject. The superstition of Abonedichos, however, comes immediately under our notice as a remarkable exhibition of the oracular serpent. To the description of a revival of this superstition in the reign of Marcus Aurelius, I will therefore devote the remainder of this section. From Lucian we learn that a native of Abonedichos, Alexander by name, being involved in pecuniary difficulties while left in Greece, determined to practice upon the credulity of his contemporaries in the character of a magician. For this purpose he went with a chosen companion to Pella, in Macedonia, a place remarkable for a singular custom, which, however, had existed from time immemorial, that of nourishing tame serpents of prodigious size, to be playfellows and companions of their infant children. Having purchased one of these animals, he sailed to Chalcedon, and there, among the ruins of an old temple of Apollo, pretended to dig up 2 brazen tablets, which had been deposited by Aesculapius, and which bore this inscription: Aesculapius and his father Apollo intend to come into Pontus, and take up their abode at Abonedichos. To Abonedichos accordingly the impostors went, with their Macedonian serpent, but before they arrived there, the companion of Alexander died. This event, however, by no means disconcerted him. The natives, forewarned, had prepared a temple for his reception, and in this he took up his abode. On an appointed day he proposed to exhibit the god Aesculapius to the people, having previously enclosed a small snake in an eggshell, and concealed it in a convenient place. When the multitude had assembled in eager expectation, he approached the spot where the eggshell had been deposited, and muttering certain Hebrew and Phoenician words, unintelligible to the people, who could only catch the words Apollo, Aesculapius, occasionally introduced, he plunged in his hand, and producing the eggshell, exclaimed that the god was within. Breaking the shell, he drew out the young snake, which was unanimously hailed as the expected god. From that day his reputation as the familiar servant of Aesculapius was established. In a few days afterwards he exhibited the large serpent within his vest, as the same god Aesculapius whom they had seen in his first state. The admiration of the people at the rapid growth of the god confirmed their original impression of his divinity. For this serpent the impostor contrived a mask with a human face made of linen, and persuaded the votaries that such was the form under which Aesculapius chose to appear. He gave the serpent the name of Glycon, and declared that he was the 3rd child of Jupiter, and the light of men. Henceforward he pretended that Glycon was oracular, and by ventriloquism caused him to give responses. Thousands of inquirers flocked from all parts of the Roman Empire to this second Delphi, and Alexander, having carried on the gainful imposture for many years, left a memorial of it upon the coins and medals of Abonedichos. Engravings of Glycon, as he appeared on these coins, are given by Spanheim p. 212. From this curious narrative we may reasonably infer that had the notion of Ophiolatria been extinct in Paphlagonia, Alexander would not have selected Abonedichos as the theater of his fraud. That Ophiolatria did, indeed, once flourish in this city is evident from its name, Alpha Beta Omega Nu Omicron Upsilon Tau Epsilon Iota Chi Omicron Sigma, city of Abon, the serpent solar god. It is probable, therefore, that some traces of it remain to the time of Alexander, who skillfully improved the superstitions of the people to his own advantage. There are proofs also of his acquaintance with the arcana of serpent worship in the story itself. The enclosing of the snake in the egg indicates his knowledge of the mythological conceit of the sacred serpent and mundane egg. The placing of the great serpent in his bosom within his garments was a revival of the old Sabasian mysteries, described in a preceding chapter. And the very name of Glycon, involving the title of the solar deity On, and illustrated by the epithet the light of men, seems to have an allusion to Ophiolatria in its connection with Sabaism. Putting together these coincidences, we may conclude that the impostor had acquired his knowledge of these ancient mysteries from some person or persons then in existence, capable of teaching him, in other words, that primitive serpent worship was still to be found in Asia Minor in the days of Marcus Aurelius. 11. The islands of Asia Minor. From the continent of Asia Minor, we pass naturally to the islands which are scattered along its shores, from Cyprus through the Carpathian and Icarian seas to the Hellespont. In this passage we follow the tract of one of the most renowned of Hittite leaders, who carried the superstitions of his native country first into the islands which lay near it, and from thence, ultimately, into Greece. It is conjectured by Bashar that the first migration of the Hivites, who fled before Joshua, was that of the Cadmonites of Mount Hermon, whose leader was Cadmus, so called from the name of the people whom he commanded. It is not likely that all the actions attributed to the adventurer Cadmus were performed by one person, for it is the genius of fable to bestow upon one person the honors acquired, and the labors undergone by many, who may have issued from the same country. The celebrated Cadmus was, therefore, a fictitious personage, who united in his history the real actions of others, whose separate achievements would not have been sufficiently marvelous for mythology. Under the guidance of this hero, that is, under the guidance of a Cadmonite from Mount Hermon, colonies of Hivites were settled in Cyprus, Rhodes, Samos, Chios, Icaria, and in those islands of the archipelago which were adjacent to Asia Minor, if not in those which were nearer to Greece. 1. The island of Cyprus was originally called Ophiusa, one that is, the place of serpents, a name which was very generally given to the settlements of the worshippers of the serpent Oph2. The tradition was that formerly these places swarmed with serpents, which, from the insular situation of most of them, is not very probable. At Paphos, Cyprus, there was a tradition of serpents who had 2 legs. This, remarks Bryant, related to men, and not to snakes. 3. 2. Rhodes was also called Ophiusa 4 and, according to Bashar, one still retains its designation in the Syrian rod, a serpent. At Rhodes there was a tradition of a number of serpents who desolated the country, and destroyed many of its inhabitants. The survivors sent to Delphi to consult the oracle, and were desired to bring over Phorbas, who, taking up his residence in the island, soon exterminated the reptiles. He was exalted after death into the constellation Ophiuchus II, which is the same with the Ophionius of Phoenicia. There are some curious coincidences with serpent worship in the history of this Phorbas. He was the grandson of Apollo and father of Iphis, in which word we recognize the root F or Oph. Apollo is the solar deity symbolized by the serpent OPH, and Phorbas may be decomposed into Phi Oreb, i.e. the oracle of the solar serpent 3. It appears also that Phorbas married Hermine, which may mean a woman of Hermon, where the Hivites resided. In the legend before us, we trace a confusion of ideas by which the oracle of the serpent god, established perhaps at Rhodes by the Hivites of Hermon, is converted into a man, Phorbas, who delivered the island from serpents. The whole story might have originated in a colony of Hivites from the continent, dispossessing the natives of Hivites also of their country. The translation of Phorbas into the constellation Ophiuchus, or Ophionius, corroborates the connection of this legend with Ophiolatria. 3. In the island of Icaria was a temple of Diana, called Toropolium, and a small town named Draconum stood upon a promontory of the same name. 1. Toropolium, according to Brian, is Tor Op El, the tower of the god Oph. We may infer, therefore, from the connection of Draconum, the town of the dragon, with Toropolium, the temple of the serpent god, that the Hivites of Phoenicia settled also in the island of Icaria. 4. A coin of Samos represents an erect serpent before a naked man holding a ring in his hand. It is probable, therefore, according to the hypothesis before laid down, that the worship of the serpent once prevailed at Samos. 5. At Chios, there was another settlement of Hivites, as the name of the island, and the tradition preserved in it, would import. Chios is derived from Hivia, the same root from whence comes Hivite one, the meaning of which word is ascertained to be a serpent. The Hivites who settled in this island were finally exterminated, According to the probable import of the following legend, at Chios was a mountain called Pelinius, i.e. according to Bashar, Pelinaz the stupendous serpent. Under this mountain, says Elion II, there lived an immense dragon, whose voice was so terrific that no one could ever approach his cave to see him. He was at length destroyed by setting fire to piles of wood placed at the mouth of the cavern. This relates probably to the destruction of a vast temple, which the Hivites had erected on that mountain, or at the foot of it. Why this Hivite temple should be called an immense dragon will be shown in the chapter which treats of Hittite temples. These were the chief settlements of the Hivites in Asia Minor, and with these notices we conclude our investigation of serpent worship in Asia. The Syrian Hivites were the Hivites of scripture, and the Cadmeans of mythology. But the name of Cadmeans was rather general than particular. It was bestowed indiscriminately upon the authors of this superstition, whether proceeding from Lebanon or Egypt. They were a twofold colony which came both from Egypt and Syria. 1. The Syrian Cadmeans colonized the islands above mentioned. The Egyptian adventurers settled first in Crete, and afterwards in the Cyclades, Peloponnesus, Greece, Samothrace, Macedonia, Illyrium, and, as we shall hereafter find, it appears then from a review of what has been already ascertained, that the worship of the serpent pervaded Babylonia, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, India, Kashmir, China, Japan, Java, Ceylon, Arabia, Syria, Colchis, and Asia Minor, a tract of country over which, the worship of the sun alone excepted, no other superstition was so uniformly spread. It entered also into the religion of the Scythian tribes, who bore for their banner the sacred dragon 1, and was carried with them probably to the river Oba, river, in whose name is preserved to the present day, a memorial of the sacred serpent Ob. It might indeed have been called the Serpent River, from its winding course, but this is not a peculiarity of any river, it is common to all, and the recorded fact that of the Ostraks, who inhabited the banks of the Obi, among their other idols, worshipped the image of a serpent too, tends strongly to corroborate our hypothesis.